Hey folks, Chris Vandeviver here from Brass Pals Recording, and today I have a video for you that is a mixing secret, quote unquote, about EQ. And the reason I say it's a secret is because it's going to fly in the face of everything that you've seen and read when it comes to EQ. And usually the line goes that our YouTube host says, hey guys, I'm going to bring up an EQ and really you only need a decibel or two of a boost or cut. Don't go crazy. And I think that's total BS. When it comes to home recordings, okay, it's a different beast if you're recording in a studio, but when it comes to home recordings or places like the home, like basements, rehearsal spaces, etc., aggressive EQ is not a bad thing. And let's consider the scenario. Why would I say that? Why would I fly in the face of all these people who are telling you to be cautious with EQ? Because they're right to an extent, right? Like it comes from a noble place because people who are recording in the homes, maybe their ears aren't tuned for EQ. They don't know what a well-balanced sound or mix or kick drum sounds like. And so they can do more damage than good with EQ. But I'm telling you that it's crap because you're dealing from a position of you're like in a catch-22. You're recording in a space that was not designed for recording. So you're starting from a place of a handicap. And so you have to be more aggressive with EQ to wrangle your tracks into position to sound awesome or at least good. Right? Usually our host has recorded tracks in a studio, right? A place that was designed and built for the purpose of recording. So there's acoustic treatment and there's microphones and whatever. And the space has a huge impact on your tracks, right? And you're recording in your bedroom or basement. Your bedroom was designed to put a bed into and to sleep in. It was not designed for recording. May it be that you tried really hard to place your instrument and tune it and all this stuff. Your room's going to leave an imprint. So you have to work with that, and that's why you can't be afraid of EQ, okay? Like you should err on the side of caution, but if you feel the need to be aggressive with EQ, don't be afraid to use it. Okay, so I want to show you this track here that was sent to me by a friend and client, and his band recorded in a concrete storage unit, okay? And that is like, that's pretty far extreme for places to record. It's not tuned at all. So I want to show you before and after the EQ adjustments I made. And I was very aggressive with EQ. And so when I bounced this track, I left a lot of the other processing on and I took off all the EQ. So you're going to hear things like compression, etc. So let's hear before and after. Before. Let's hear after. All right, let's hear like before and after back to back. Okay, and I don't want to argue that this is like the best or worst mix or best or worst recorded tracks, whatever. I mean, like the band did what they could with what they had. And I did the best I could with what I had, the raw materials of the recorded tracks. In this particular circumstance, I only had a stereo pair of room mics for the drums, and I only had a stereo pair of the close mics. They didn't have like the channels available to record like a dedicated kick drum track or snare track, or at least when they put it to their computer, they didn't have enough inputs for it. So they just had two drum tracks they sent me, room and close mics combined. So I kind of manufactured my own kick drum track, snare track, tom track based on this close mic track. I processed each copy differently. Okay, so I want to walk you through my processing right now of how I got to this point with aggressive EQ. So I always like to start at the drum bus because I think to myself, the drums are one instrument that just happens to be made up of a bunch of instruments. So let's treat it holistically first and then work our way down. So in this particular case, I use the Sonymous EQ, and I cut just a tiny bit to start with the mids to remove some boxy tones. I boosted the upper mids around 4.9 just to get some more smack and attack out of the drums. A little bit of a lift, just 1 decibel, 6K and up to try to give it a little more air and top end. Let's hear before and after. That already makes a pretty big difference, right? It's starting to sound a little more like a drum kit. Then with the Soundtoys EQ, which is called the sie-q, I did another lift in the top end, but way more aggressive because I really like the lift on this thing. About 6 decibels. I don't even know what the frequency is. I did a little bit of a cut at 700 to try to remove more boxy tone, and I boosted the low end a crazy amount. But you'll see that I did a lot of cutting in the low end later. So let's hear before and after with that. Okay, now the kick drum has a lot of woofiness to it, but you're going to see there's a lot of cutting later. So already our drums are sounding more polished, as polished as they can. Now let's bring in just the room mics here. So I have this plugin from Acon Digital called D-Filter, and what it basically does is it looks at the incoming audio, and based on the preset that you have, it's going to look at the audio and say, are there resonances? Is there comb filtering? Are there things that we need to cut or boost? Is there a crazy resonance that we need to cut dramatically? So, the processing, in my opinion, is very heavy-handed most of the time, but you have the option of taking this line and kind of dragging it down and up. And what happens is you're setting basically the percentage, the mix of how hard you want it to process with EQ. In the room mic case, my goal was to take the room mics and make them more of like overhead mics and accentuate the cymbals. So that's why I left it mostly at 100%, but I didn't want it to do much at the top end because I think the curve kind of went like this and just went straight up and boosted a ton in this region. I didn't want that. So let's hear before and after with this. So this cut between 100 and 500 hertz is removing some of the boxy tone, removing some of the kick and snare tone. But again, I'm trying to accentuate the top end, the cymbals, because I want it more as overheads. All right. Then we bring in a linear EQ. And what I have this doing is just a high pass. And I use a linear EQ to try to prevent any sort of phase shift between my multi-mic instruments. So it's got a 40 hertz. That's about that for the overheads. Okay. Now let's bring in the kick. Now the kick has a lot of woofiness to it. And with the linear EQ, I have it cutting at 25 hertz, but I also have it boosting way, way low because I wanted to bring in some of that subsonic content. Let's hear before and after. Okay, you might not be able to perceive that based on your listening playback device, but let's bring in the Slick EQ from Tokyo Dawn Labs. Now, what's going on here is I'm boosting 70 hertz because if you noticed on the linear EQ, there's a weird dip between 50 and 100 hertz where usually a kick drum kind of like has a huge boost right here and then drops down. There's this weird knock in the middle. So I want to bring that back up 3 dBs, and then I am cutting by 6 dB at 120 hertz because, again, of that woofy nature of the kick that just is not necessary. And then I'm boosting 3 decibels at 3K because I've noticed that there's a nice smack to the kick around that region. And I even have a little bit of a tilt EQ going on to try to bring it more into the upper registers. So let's hear before and after here. I'm going to bypass it on the plugin. So now the kick is starting to have less of that woofiness and having more of like a smacky kick sound. And then I use the Acon D-Filter again, and look at that. We're cutting a ton, around 100 to 500 hertz, and I've got this set at about wet, 56 point whatever it was, right? So let's hear that before and after. Again, getting rid of the woofiness, making it more top-end centric. Where, the kick drum is a low-end instrument, but like you don't need that much low-end, So that was very aggressive. Let's bring in the snare now. And once again, I have a linear EQ. Now, you have to remember, this is just the close mic track copied 4 times. I've got a snare mic, quote-unquote, a kick supposed mic, a tom supposed mic, and then I have like the holistic close mic track. So each one's being processed differently to try to bring out the snare, bring out the kick, bring out the toms. But I mean, they're all the same thing at the end of the day. So, you know, some of these drums might sound a little weird by themselves, but I also had to take into account that there's going to be the same exact bleed on the other tracks. So it was this weird balancing act. So with the snare track, I got a high pass filter at 100 hertz. I've got this dip at around 130 because I'm trying to remove this kick activity that's happening here, but boosting 200 hertz to try to bring out the snare body. And then I've got this tremendous dip, 22, very narrow, to try to suck out this weird ring to the snare. So let's hear before and after. Okay. And then let's bring in the Tokyo Dawn Labs EQ again, the Slick EQ. And I mean, some of this seems counterintuitive. You know, again, it was a balancing act between, you know, the same track copied 4 times. I'm cutting quite a bit at 80 hertz. You know, I guess at the time it felt necessary. I'm boosting at 150, which seems counterintuitive to, what was it? The cut at 130, but I was trying to balance the snare body against that kick thud that was occurring. And then a little bit of a lift at 5K to try to brighten up the whole thing. Let's hear this before and after. You know, the kick starts to sound a little more stable in the mix. And the snare has more body. It's a little darker, but I think it was worthwhile for that body. Okay, now let's bring in our close mic track. So this is the same exact, you know, track, the same exact region, but just processed with the idea that this is the holistic version of all these mics. A Con D filter that has decided upon itself to cut, again, 100 to 500 hertz, and I've got it set wet to 45, 46%, where this is what it would look like at 100%. You know, that's pretty crazy. It doesn't need to be that nuts. So, and if you don't have the money or whatever to buy this plugin, but you want to use it, I think the demo, the only limitation is just that it goes silent once in a while. So you can use this plugin to inform you how to EQ, and you'll just have to use a different EQ to process it. So let's hear before and after with the close mics in there. You know, so it was this constant balancing act, this constant battle of trying to maintain the snare and kick body while eliminating a lot of this woofy content. Another linear EQ, cutting at about 100 hertz. Okay, Tokyo Dawn Labs again. And this time it's cutting at about 650 hertz. Boosting about 3K at 3 dB to try to bring in more of that stick attack and smack here before and after. Okay. And then for our tom track, which isn't really a tom track, it's just I chopped out the toms and processed them differently. Another linear EQ that's cutting at 100 hertz, which is pretty aggressive for a tom. But I mean, I did the best I could. It's not the best sounding tom, just based on the nature of the track. And then I boosted 5K to try to bring out some smack. I cut at about 600 hertz to remove some of that cardboardy sound and boosted the low end at 100 hertz, try to bring in some low end. So let's just hear this tom here. Okay, so not the most inspiring tom, but you know, what can you do? Okay, now let's move our way down to the bass. So with the bass, what I did was I just have a channel EQ with a high pass filter at 20 hertz to remove any sort of like weird DC offset or DC content. And because I don't have any more mics for the bass, I just use the channel EQ and don't bother with a linear EQ. And then I use the retro EQ from Plugin Mix, and I was very aggressive. I boosted 5K by quite a bit. I cut some mid content quite a bit, and then boosted the low end to try to make it sound less like an uninspiring DI. So let's hear before and after. Right? And then the guitars, this is the last part I'm going to show you here. I was very, very aggressive with the guitars. First of all, I have D filter, and I've got probably each one set at 25%. And it's just kind of like tucking and boosting, just any sort of resonances that felt off. So let's hear before and after. Oh, we got to hear the guitars first, don't we? So the guitars sound less boxy. Then we brought in a channel EQ, and I'm cutting at 120 hertz because there's some low end stuff in the guitars that felt unnecessary. There's a whistling in the guitar sound at 1900 hertz that I was ruthless across the guitars to remove. And let's just hear that before and after. Okay, here we go. And that whistling just disappears. Then I use the retro EQ and I boost it a little at 8K to try to lift and give it more presence. I remove some more at 200 hertz to try to make it less, low endy. Let's hear that. What's kind of weird is it loses like this fizziness and almost a presence to it with the retro EQ, but then I just brought it right back with the Sonymous Sweet Tone, which is basically a tilt EQ, and I was pretty aggressive with the tilt. I tilted it towards the top end. So let's hear that before and after, right? So now the guitars get very aggressive. So after all that, let's hear the before and after again, all right? And so, again, I'm not going to argue if this is the best mix you've ever heard in your life, but I think we've taken this track from a very, very modest, humble place to at least a more palatable one, and something that I think the band could be a lot more proud of. So that's my argument for aggressive EQ. Don't let these folks on YouTube, these blog posts, dissuade you if you feel it necessary to EQ aggressively. Now, any process that you use in your mixes, you should first stop yourself and listen to the track and say, hey, does this sound good? Does it sound balanced? Does it sound the way I want it to? If yes, don't touch it. If it sounds good, do not touch it. But if it doesn't sound good, then you need to ask yourself, why doesn't it sound good? And that's when you start making those processing decisions. So I hope that was helpful to you. If you have any questions, if you have any opinions, if you have, opposing opinions or you try this yourself and you'd like to toss your hat into the ring, I'd love to hear from you. Thank you so much. Take care.